Hey everybody, welcome to week 12, I'm pretty sure. We're making some great progress in this course, and I hope we're ready to learn about some of the institutions and their intermediaries that drive our political lives. So, when we look at today's lecture, a lot of what we're going to cover is review. So we're going to bounce into some past topics. We're going to make sure we highlight some of the important concepts that we have to understand to better understand the content covered in this week's lecture. We're going to look into a handful of specific institutions, predominantly some of those that I examined in my thesis when I was a graduate student, including interest groups, political parties, the media, our government. Think of the three branches through the lens of an institutional mindset. So we're going to understand a lot of what we've already examined in the past through another lens that helps us better understand the way in which we interact with our government. So let's get going. So I want to start with a bit of valuable review. These are just some things I want to run through very quickly before I hit the new dimensions of these topics. So to start, united in a divided government. Remember, this has nothing to do with our government's ability to work together, but exclusively focuses on how many of the electoral bodies and the majorities within them regarding parties. So if we have a united government, we have one single political party leading the majorities in the House and the Senate and maintaining the presidency. If we have a divided government, we have two political parties maintaining majorities in those three electoral bodies. Spatial issues. These are issues that offer a wide range of possible policy positions along a single spectrum. Think of minimum wage as the prime example. Valence issues, these are issues in which greater values are always encouraged by all citizens. Think of it like honesty of representation. And when we look at how we vote the way we do, among the general population, there are three reasons we vote. It's either through party loyalties. Remember, 80% of the population maintains their party identification that they created in their youth. We're going to have issues involved, either spatial or valence issues, and we're going to have candidate characteristics that will drive voters. We also reflect back to week 4, I believe, when we covered some ideologies that drive American perspectives. And one of those was presented by Edmund Burke. And today we're going to examine institutions in detail. And Edmund Burke has a unique sentiment, the father of conservatism, on institutions, as he focuses on the sentiment that the institutions that guide our lives in particular, are the greatest goods that we have inherited from past generations. So in order to respect past generations and their progress, we must make gradual change within our institutions and have, of course, exclusively gradual change and no revolutionary sentiments regarding institutional design. We also look at our Bill of Rights. We're going to see a concept repeated about federalism. And remember, federalism is that equal exchange between state and central entities. And we look at the 10th Amendment best depicting our foundational elements of federalism. As it states, what is not directly addressed by the federal government is left up to the states, and particularly the people. And of course, selective incorporation. Without this process, we would not have the 10th Amendment applying to also restricting state governments as well. Think of this as anything not addressed within the state government is left up to the city governments. So we see the 10th Amendment also through selective incorporation applying to states as well as the federal government. This relied upon the Equal Protection Clause of our 14th Amendment. As we remember, the selective incorporation process happened after the ratification of the 14th Amendment from Reconstruction into the Civil Rights era, as we applied the Bill of Rights on a case-by-case basis to state governments as well. And we will talk about some powers of the presidency, and in particular, express powers. These will represent formal dimensions of the institution of the executive, and express powers are, as we remember, powers granted to the president that are directly written in the Constitution or our statutory laws. So let's dive into today's topic. What is an institution? Well, institutions are, for one, very important detail, humanly devised entities that are enduring structures and rules that structure political, economic, and social life. Think of this as, the way that we interact with our government is through the lens of the media, through our affiliation with interest groups, through our activities within political parties. So these are the humanly devised, and emphasis on humanly devised because these are not unhuman entities. These are entities represented by living human beings at any given moment. And an institution must be created by individuals and maintained by individuals, an important emphasis to make, the one that Edmund Burke would emphasize among our civic duties. So they're humanly devised structures and rules, so they don't just have to be a physical entity. You don't have to think of the media as an institution, but also a lot of these sentiments within the media, a lot of those established rules as institutions, and even some of those less formal rules. We'll go into that momentarily. And when we look at institutions at large, we can kind of identify some base requirements to include an entity as an institution. Think of it as collectives of humans who have established a system or of formal and informal rules with a shared common goal. So when we look at institutions at large, we'll do this with each of the institutions under analysis in today's lecture, but we're going to identify the formal and informal dimensions of these institutions. When you think of formal dimensions and formal institutions at large, we think of the U.S. Constitution, Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, our legal codes that guide our lives, and official procedures, and far more. When we look at informal institutions, we can see these as norms established through precedent, tradition, expectations maintained by citizens. Some examples include the filibuster, committee rules, norms of bipartisanship, and so much more. As we see, the informal dimensions of our institutions are extensive. So when we look at institutions, I think it's beneficial to start by analyzing our three branches of government as institutions, which we haven't exactly done in the past. So when we look at them as institutions, it's important to understand that the U.S. system at large is not just three branches that are fulfilling certain duties. It is a web of formal and informal institutions linking citizens and bodies of governance. So we look at Congress, the presidency, and the judicial branch, predominantly the Supreme Court, as institutions. We can see them in multiple lenses, but we could identify both formal and informal dimensions that build them up to be institutions. So we see Congress as an institution. Some of the formal dimensions, well, of course, our statutory guidance, the Article 1 of our U.S. Constitution, in which we have the roadmap for the objective, undeniable rules of this body. Think of formal dimensions of an institution as the objective, undeniable rules. We can see this includes the apportionment of representatives, the powers granted to the legislative body, and formal rules and procedures that they must follow when acting within Congress. Individuals must follow when acting within Congress. We can also see some of the informal dimensions. Think of the party leadership. Think of the unspoken seniority rules that in some instances, historically, like Speaker of the House, although that is not the case anymore, we see that it was simply the senior most member of Congress who was granted certain powers or authority. And that was never established in any written code. And it is a general practice established through precedent maintained by previous Congresspeople. So we see seniority rules, norms of reciprocity. By reciprocity, I mean, you give your neighbor sugar, one day they may give you salt, whatever it may be, you give in order to return, to have something returned. Think of it among Congress as, I will sign your bill if you will sign my bill, or extend funding to my projects for my constituents, etc. We also understand an informal dimension of Congress is polarization and partisanship, or bipartisanship and the lack of bipartisanship. And there is far more when you think of the informal dimensions. Think of it as the practices maintained through precedent. So when we look at the presidency, we see the formal dimensions, Article 2 of our Constitution, which we lay out the roadmap for this office, this institution, and which we identify the extent of executive agencies. Remember, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, and so many, Department of Education, the extent to which those can operate. Cabinet structures, the degree in which, the process in which we appoint cabinet members and the role that they play within our federal government, in addition to all express powers granted to the president within Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. We also have to remember the informal dimensions of the presidency. Think of executive norms. Executive orders also represent one of these informal dimensions, as there has been more of a, I guess you could say, gray area in the efficacy of executive orders and how exactly what they do. We see media presence, the extent to which a president and the presidency as an institution utilizes the media, bureaucratic networks in which mobilize or dismantle certain legislative engagements. And then we also see the judicial branch as an institution. The formal dimensions, of course, once again, Article 3 of the US Constitution. You're seeing a trend here. The formal dimensions are the written legal codes guiding these bodies. Think of it as how we have lifetime appointments, how we have maintenance of judicial review after Marbury versus Madison, and the existence of the Supreme Court at large. Now, when we look at the judicial branch as an institution and their informal dimensions, we see a reliance on precedent. And by that, I mean when a previous court, say the Supreme Court from 1952, ruled on a case, that is the current starting point for contemporary Supreme Courts to interpret. Think of this as also judicial ideology. Remember that discussion, originalism versus living constitutionalism, in which we identified the ideology separate from partisanship or traditional ideological affiliations of liberalism and conservatism that guide our justices' interpretations. And of course, internal norms. Think of it as the Chief Justice has in certain instances a little bit more influence and sway among the body. So our three branches of government are not just three bodies, but three institutions that have formal and informal dimensions that guide our daily economic and political lives. So when we look at these institutions, how do they change and how do they develop over time? I think the best way to look at it is through the feedback loop presented at the top of this slide. It starts with citizen sentiments, and then this develops into public opinion. Of course, as we present our views, we accumulate to not just be an individual, but masses and a collective with a maintained sentiment. This is then represented within our media institutions. This is where the institutional impact really starts to build. We see the media, the political parties, our interest groups representing the citizens' individual interests that were solidified through public opinion and now represented through calls to action within these three institutional entities. This will then impact formal institutions like what we just covered, Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, and more, which will then impact policy. So this policy, of course, it is a feedback loop. And what is the original thing that drives the sentiments of citizens? It is the policies that guide their lives. And this will repeat the loop again, revisiting the interests of citizens. So we see institutions change with a feedback loop that is constantly repeating, that starts, in a sense, with the sentiments of citizens. Now, when we look at political scientists' work on institutional change, it may surprise you. There's far more disagreement and nuance to the discussion than you may expect. We have two general pathways for how individual political scientists view institutional change. Some say there is path dependence. This basically states that past decisions lock in future possibilities. Past decisions will create gradual change that will inevitably and eventually occur. Now, this is in contrast to those political scientists who maintain the sentiment of critical juncture. It kind of argues change occurs when we have a significant event. Think of economic crisis, a major war, a political party realignment like the 1960s. So we can have either one or two views. It takes critical junctures in history to have these pivotal changes within institutions. It is, I guess you could say, the spark to a revolution or a significant change, where path dependence says there is no single spark that leads to any inevitable end. There are many small actions that will create a path dependence, a gradual, inevitable trajectory for these institutions. Think of it as, let me try and make a basketball analogy here. Critical juncture is saying we won the game because we made that buzzer beater game-winning three-pointer. Path dependence is saying we won the game because we made all those free throws throughout the game. That gave us one extra point throughout. Those small decisions in the past that locked in an inevitable and eventual future possibility. Not the best example, but I like to try and tie in basketball whenever I get the opportunity. So when we talk about change within institutions, how else can we look at this? Well, we can see there are 5 primary mechanisms that lead to change. And if you want to dive into this in more detail, the source is available in the PowerPoint. And if you have a hard time finding that, just email me. So the 5 mechanisms for change within institutions, we see 1, displacement. This is when old rules are replaced by new ones, of course, directly changing the operations and workings of an institution. Pretty direct there. We also see layering. These are when new rules are added on top of existing structures, sometimes resulting in the lack of efficacy of existing structures and rules, and a re-examination of how these rules will influence the outcomes of the institution. We also see drift. This is generally led by the population. This is where rules stay the same, but the society or economic incentives around the institution shift and diminish the effectiveness of previous rules. So we also know conversion. These are where existing institutions are used in new ways. Say you have when we created the Department of Homeland Security, there's a great example of this. We already had all the entities that made up the Department of Homeland Security just operating through different with different focuses. We had collectives focusing on immigration and the borders, while we did not have them working alongside TSA with protection of our, flying population. So that is a great example of these changes. We also see exhaustion. These are where institutions lose legitimacy and or functionality and eventually fade away. So conversion represents how under the Department of Homeland Security we shifted the direction of a lot of these institutions and made them more focused along the unanimous effort of domestic security. Exhaustion is where they will generally lose their ability to function optimally, as oftentimes due to neglect from policymakers. So when we talk about institutional change, one important dimension of that feedback loop was public opinion. And it's really important to understand how public opinion is formulated and understand that public opinion simply consists of the aggregate of individual attitudes or beliefs shared by some portion of the adult population, not the majority, not the minority, but at least some portion. And this can vary in how many, whatever percentage is needed, how many individuals to really impact general society. So public opinion is an essential element of institutional development. In a pluralist system, without public opinion, without entities representing public opinion, pluralism is in effect ineffective. So when we look at public opinion and the formation of it, there's one term that is essential to understand and essential to understand the impact of, and that is framing. Framing is something that influences and impacts our daily lives as we obtain information through these institutions. It is the ability of the presenters of information, of polling data, whatever the metric is, it is their ability to establish the context for a polling question or media report or piece of information. Framing can generally mean they're fitting an event or data point or statement into a familiar story that activates preconceived beliefs or prejudices. Now, what do I mean by that? It is the way you label something that influences the visualization that people have. There was a concept, I forget the sociologist, but I remember hearing this in graduate school about how somebody examined conversation. And they said conversation is not a verbal act. It's not a linguistic act as much as it is a visual act. It is an attempt to paint another person a picture using your words. And when we use different framing, we are painting immensely different pictures. Let's take the most inflammatory and easily understood example of women's reproductive rights, or as we say, access to abortion treatments, which would be either framed as pro-life or pro-choice. And we know without explanation the preconceived beliefs and prejudices that are mobilized when one says pro-life or pro-choice. So this framing is impactful. It guides public opinion and helps shift general sentiments. Now, when we look at framing at large, and when we look at the information we are obtaining, I think the most beneficial thing that any citizen can do is understand when they are obtaining empirical and normative information. And this is important for your term paper because we are not allowed to rely on normative claims. And as political scientists trying to make the least scientific part of our daily lives a science, we have to meet higher standards and rely exclusively on empirical statements, judgments, and analyses. So what is the difference? An empirical statement is a statement based on an assessment of data without regard to value. So you're saying the unemployment rate is 1.2, whatever the unemployment rate is. This is resulting in blank million people without employment. That is empirical. You're saying here's a data point and here's an objective result of that data point. Now, on the opposite end, a normative statement is any statement that invokes judgment or evaluation, or said another way, that relies on your analysis. Anecdotal, it's another term, I guess you could say, for a normative statement. So that is basically stating that unemployment has gone up because I see so many more people living on the streets. Well, there is no objective evidence supporting that claim. The support for the claim is my perspective on the world. Now, we all have a tendency to present information, especially in our papers. I'm grading those right now, and there's a lot of normative claims. Don't beat yourself up. It happens. We're not going to do it on the final term paper, though. There are a lot of moments where we explain, present, and understand the world through a normative lens. I mean, we are the center of all of our universes. That's the only way we can see the world around us. But when we write scientifically about civil society, it is essential to be empirical. And when we obtain information about the world we live in, it is important to use that taste test. Am I relying on information presented through the lens of the presenter, or am I relying on information presented through the data that the presenter is relying upon? So we talk about public opinion, a term comes up, a term that was pivotal in my graduate thesis. I'm not going to require you have that level of examination on it, but I think it'd be beneficial for me to use some of my experience and present it to you. So when I examined nationalization and its impact on public opinion, I identified two terms regarding nationalization. These are very different terms, so very different definitions. So nationalization, when regarding the industries of governance, that is when there's a transition that brings privately owned, think of it as Coca-Cola. They're privately owned for profit and their prices are regulated via competition, brings privately owned industries and companies under public authority. Now say, this is not being called for and this is not an action, but say Coca-Cola was bought by the government and they said, okay, well, we're not going to be driven based off of profit and competition and instead off of ensuring access. So the state would take control of a certain industry and provide those resources or goods in a specific way. Think of it, this is not something that happens frequently, predominantly in Western democracies that have capitalistic economic foundations, although we acknowledge we have a mixed economy. We do see that this has happened in the past, though. Nationalization of some industries occurred during security threats, national security threats. One example of this is the nationalization of airport security after the event of 9/11. We said we cannot have this based off of a airport by airport private industry sentiment, that it is up to the interest of the airport themselves to determine the security rules and regulations that they will maintain. Instead, the government will step in and provide unanimous resources, unanimous TSA security to all airlines in the United States. That was the nationalization of airline industries. Now, we see there's within the Democratic Party a current push to do this regarding some healthcare practices, although it is not necessarily the focus of the current Congress, as there is more so focus on how to deal with current healthcare funding over nationalizing that industry. But we think of this simply as industry-based definition of nationalization is when the state takes control, the federal government takes control of an industry or business for the general good of the population. Now, when we look at another definition of nationalization, this is completely different. This is what relates to public opinion. This is what I refer to as the social definition of nationalization. This is where you have a transition from a locally oriented presence to a nationally oriented presence. So what do I mean by that? That is when you put down the Daily Interlake, your local newspaper from Kalispell, and you pick up the New York Times on your phone or Fox News on your phone, whatever it may be. It is shifting from what shifting from understanding the world through our neighborhood and our local community, through understanding the world through our lens of the nation and our global role. We see that this is oftentimes and in recent years driven by technology. And this is what a lot of my thesis covered. What is the impact of nationalization among civil society? Well, my thesis argued that the nationalization of institutions, for example, the media, interest groups, political parties, and my predominant institution of analysis, the market, has resulted in shifts in how we interact within these institutions that used to place us through help us understand the world through the lens of our local community. As we know through anecdotal evidence, a normative claim here is that you may have a crazy neighbor of opposing viewpoints, but they may have also offered to, mow your lawn one day, and you have more positive views of them than you may of the, let me find the Marjorie Taylor Greene or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez representatives on the national stage that are not locally embedded. So locally oriented information has a tendency to minimize levels of polarization, as my thesis identified, but that's not the focus here in this slide. The focus here in this slide is understanding what the social definition of nationalization is and how technology has driven the push towards nationalization, as it has encouraged us through access of information via mobile phones to look at events in the world around us through the lens of our national affiliations, our national identities over our Kalispell identities. So one thing we're talking about here, especially in that last point, is the concept of federalism, the interplay between local governments and federal governments. And when we look at federalism in the United States, here are just some bullet points, a little bit of review here, but just some things I want to emphasize. We know that federalism allows state governments to act as laboratories of change. This last week gives the best example of this. We had mayoral elections in both Kalispell, in many local governments, but we also had one in New York City. But the New York City mayoral election caught the nation's attention. Now, when we look at our perspectives on this, whether you like Mamdani or you do not like Mamdani, I don't think it matters if we live in Kalispell, because the existence of Mamdani and the existence of people with opposing views, heavily capitalist, conservative sentiments that do govern many local entities. Well, we see the diversity of state governments, of local governments, allows for laboratories of change. In the United States, due to federalism and due to certain campaigns and elections in certain cities, we can test theoretical concepts. We are currently testing the concept of economic redistributive policies in New York City. Well, if they are implemented, we would be testing that in New York City. Now, this protects us Montanans from being at risk of negative harms from these policies. But our federal government has the benefit of being able to say, when that local government enacted that certain policy, it brought these benefits and detriments. And if we can pull the best and address the worst, we can implement some policies that are non-traditional on the federal level that can benefit the general public. So states, both extremely liberal, extremely democratic, both extremely conservative, extremely Republican, state governments and local governments act as laboratories of change for us to test out concepts of governance, which is why we have the system that exists today, through constant testing of concepts within federal governance. So we also see the supremacy clause. Now, this is kind of a check on that laboratory of change concept. We acknowledge that sometimes that change can be a little bit extensive and not representative of the nation's goals. We see this during the civil rights era, as many southern states had extensive pro-segregationist policies, and it took the federal government implementing and emphasizing the supremacy clause that if it is addressed within our federal government, then they have the influence over state governments. Federal law shall be the law of the land and will always trump state law. So we see this as a check on that laboratory of change when that change and that test goes a little too far and starts restricting the security or the liberty of citizens. Now, we also remember the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment kind of protects the opposite of the supremacy clause, protects the dimensions of our federal government being laboratories of change. As our 10th Amendment, we remember, states that what is not directly addressed by the federal government is left up to the states and the people. And of course, remember selective incorporation, as that was also, as we had the Bill of Rights also implemented on state governments as well as federal governments. So the role of federalism regarding public opinion, regarding influencing institutions, is significant, and it allows for experimentation with restrictions through the supremacy clause within the United States. So when we look at, so what we're going to do now is we're going to dive into some specific institutions. Let's start with the institution of the media. We're going to do this by looking at some formal and informal dimensions, and then I'll ramble on a bit about some of the concepts that I've examined within these bodies when looking at them through an institutional frame. So formal dimensions of the institution of the media, we see the First Amendment guiding our abilities of free speech. We see the FCC that has regulatory powers over our media and the information that they can present. We have seen that come into focus in recent years with recent weeks regarding the FCC's role in regulating the sentiments spoken on late night talk shows. We see the AP style book, which if you've gone into journalism or hope to go into journalism, this will make you cry at least once, because it is the linguistic guidelines that sometimes break the general English precedent you grew up learning in high school, in the most frustrating ways too. But it establishes how you will present information in your writing. And then we see the Code of Ethics basically stating, the general guidelines, written guidelines for what is a valid source, how to present information, how to minimize subjectivity and encourage objectivity. We also see the informal dimensions of the media as an institution include the unwritten rules about the best practices, because some of these ethics that are not directly addressed in the Code of Ethics guiding our journalists, we also see are unwritten and spoken rules that our journalists maintain throughout their practices. We also see professional and cultural assumptions maintained within certain corporations or among the general public. We see incentives like ratings, clicks, and revenue that also drive media to act in certain ways. And of course, these are informal dimensions, not blatantly written, but we do have to acknowledge their guidance on the direction and actions of our institutions, predominantly the media. We also know technology is altering our media landscape. Just like I said in the last slide when I focused on my thesis, nationalization is present within our institution of the media. And there's one study by Lisa George and Joel Waldfogel that examines the New York Times as it was implemented into a local community that did not have nationally oriented newspapers prior. And they examined this influence and acknowledged that when a nationally oriented newspaper is implemented in a locally oriented media network, media market, there are significant shifts. This has a long-lasting impact and has impacts that range from the economic environment of that community to the social environment of the daily lives of those individuals. We see that after the New York Times was implemented, there was a segregation of information. There were individuals that had college education who gravitated towards the New York Times and dismissed the local coverage newspapers, while those without college education tended to gravitate towards the locally oriented news and dismiss the New York Times presentation of news. So we had individuals within this community that previously obtained the same information, had the same understanding of what's going on around them, obtaining different information with, beyond being different sources, being different angles of analysis, one focusing on a national news impact and another focusing on local news impacts. And when the local news was able to present information through the local oriented mindset, you could look at conflicts like war in Afghanistan and not just see it as what's happening in Afghanistan, but how does this impact my community? Are there people that I grew up with who have gone to this conflict, who have lost their lives engaging with this conflict? It embeds yourself through your local community and helps you understand the world through that lens, through an already accessible lens. While New York Times, in this example, would present a more generalized way of understanding something. It does not allow that locally oriented humanity to be included in the storytelling. So when we also see beyond a segregation of information, we see a shift in how the local news will even cover the content they cover. So we see shifts in market incentives beyond shifts in the general civil society. So those market incentive changes result in the local newspaper not covering international news anymore. They used to cover that war in Afghanistan and tell you about the people in your community who were involved and engaged in that conflict. But today, they acknowledge that anybody looking for information on Afghanistan will be grabbing the New York Times. And what is best for us? Let's talk about that cat in the tree down the street. Okay, that's not the best example, but they would have more locally oriented important news, maybe focusing on water rights within their local community, regulatory aspects of the local government. So we see the institution of the media having informal and formal dimensions guided by our Constitution to appointed individuals like the head of the FCC, and of course in the unspoken and unwritten rules guiding the practices of those operating within this institution. Because remember, every institution is humanly devised. So there are always the unspoken, unwritten guidelines of humanity that will guide individuals who represent the actions of this institution. Now, we talk about news. Let's make one quick distinction. What is hard and what is soft news? Hard news, this is traditional news with items deriving their value from recent relevant events, basically stating its impact matters. It matters because it impacts you. It impacts those around you, the lives we have, and within a reasonable rationale, there is a line in which this news will impact your life, either economic, social, political lives. Now, soft news, these are stories that are far more fun. Stories about celebrities, they're feature stories, they're, sports stories. It's news items that derive their value from, well, proximity, timeliness, or, interest to the reader or viewer. So we think of this as soft news is, it's very relevant, it's very exciting, and it's very timeless, and it's close to us. I mean, your local baseball team just broke the league record for most home runs hit. That is an example of soft news. Kim Kardashian just released this new product. I don't know what she does. I think she's a lawyer or something. I don't know what she does. But that's an example of soft news. Hard news is stating, well, we have declared a draft and we are going into this conflict. Hard news is the economic standing of the United States is declining or improving, and it will impact your economic mobility. Those issues, the issues that directly impact your economic, political, or social lives. Not as much social, more so economic and political. So when you think about this, for one, remember the distinction between hard and soft news, but also ask yourself, when you obtain news, how much of it is hard and how much of it is soft news? Now, let's look at political parties as an institution. You're probably seeing a trend here. We're going to look at the formal and informal dimensions of political parties. Remember, of course, political parties are organized institutions that gain and maintain political power via elected officials, whether that is them governing, their actions while governing, the policy they're implementing, the campaigns ran, or various points along the process. We see when we look at political parties, the formal dimensions of this institution include the federal regulations that they must abide by, the candidate nomination processes that results in what starts as a party candidate eventually being a presidential nominee. We see the organizational structures that leadership, the systems of leadership within political parties, and think of that as the activists of a political party. And then we see, of course, the Electoral College, a constitutionally guided and protected institution that guides our political parties during this process. So we see the informal dimensions include the citizens' attachment with these political parties. Remember why we vote the way we vote? It's because, well, 80% of us maintain a partisan attachment to our political parties. We also see the unwritten norms of the elected representatives of these political parties and the elected unwritten norms of how we interact with those of opposing political viewpoints. We see the sentiments of party leadership, and of course, a great example of an informal dimension of our political party institution is political polarization, as it significantly guides the process, although the actions of our political parties, although it does not have any written guidelines in any statutory law or our constitution. So we see parties have a couple responsibilities. For one, they are in charge of their primary elections, as we remember, which is a pivotal dimension of why they were able to restrict minorities from reaching the polls during the Civil Rights era and Reconstruction era, predominantly the Reconstruction era, actually. And we also remember that they have the responsibility and ability to maintain state and federal party level party structures. So what do I mean by that? How does the Republican Party of Kalispell, Montana, influenced the Republican Party of Washington, D.C.? And that is more important than we often consider. Now, we see when we look at recent years, as is another dimension my thesis examined, we see that we are experiencing nationalization within the institution of political parties, the nationalization under the social definition, of course. And this is resulting in national party entities, think of the Republican Party of Washington, D.C., having more influence over locally oriented Kalispell, Montana Republican political party. And that is traditionally the opposite of how that worked. We used to have locally oriented political parties that allowed diversity within each political party, but our label and identification within this political party encouraged our positive interaction on these nuanced issues. We see this we see no better example of this than labor sentiments among political parties throughout U.S. history. As in the past, we saw a lot of small-scale labor sentiments broiling up within local communities, eventually influencing the national sentiment within that political party, while in recent years we see more of a opposite influence as the national party's policies and sentiments on specific issues have a tendency to influence the locally oriented political parties. So we see political parties, just like the media, experiencing a period of nationalization in which we're prioritizing the interest of the national political parties over the interest of locally oriented political parties. And of course, this is not constant. And there are scenarios where the local interests are appealed to, but we see at higher rates than ever nationalization of political parties. So, interest groups. This is the last of the three institutions examined under Paul Pierson and Eric Schickler's Meso-Institutional Analysis of Political Polarization, in which they wrote the work Madison's Constitution Under Stress, a very fascinating work, one that guided my thesis, and I think is very interesting when they examined the development of the three institutions, the two we examined, and the predominant institution of interest groups. And of course, just like the last two, Paul Pierson and Eric Schickler identified a notable degree of nationalization within the institution of interest groups. Now, what does it look like within an interest group? Well, previously, long time ago, interest groups would represent the interests of their collective, their general population that agrees with them, by communicating to elected representatives. Now, this practice, due to the process of nationalization, has developed to be more so an act in the campaigning process of like-minded candidates instead of representing the interests of your collective to already elected candidates. So that shift in the actions of interest groups has been a result of nationalization and resulted in greater political polarization within this institution. Now, what is this institution? It is a collective. Interest groups, they are a collective of individuals, of course, very important to remember, collective of individuals with shared goals who are trying to influence government and policy, oftentimes through the means of lobbying. So, interest groups can be ideological, special interest, corporate, professional, and more. We remember there are so many interest groups that range from the most obvious, interest group presenting the interests of conservative Americans or liberal Americans, whatever it may be, to interest groups that have the most niche interest and mindset. Now, when we look at them through an means to justify certain ends mindset, we can see their end goal is always to influence public policy and drive shifts in public opinion. Their end goal is to influence public policy and shift public opinion, oftentimes with the incentive of eventually influencing public policy. Now, what are the means by which they try and achieve this end goal? Well, the means are campaign contributions, lobbying, public education, grassroots mobilization. And the sentiment echoed by Paul Pierson and Eric Schickler, and later in my thesis, is that the practice of lobbying, public education, and at times grassroots mobilization has been dismissed for the prioritization of campaign contributions and certain dimensions of grassroots mobilization that influence public opinion with the eventual incentive to influence the campaign processes. A bit nuanced of a sentiment to look into in this course, but I think it's beneficial for me to say it and give those of you interested the information. Now, when we look at interest groups, there are two terms that come up when we talk about their efficacy. That is zero-sum policy. In a pluralist system of government, when you have multiple groups vying for power, multiple interest groups vying for their interests within a single system, there are times where a zero-sum policy comes into reality. That is a policy debate in which any victory by one side comes at the expense of the opposing side and can result in a lack of compromise. This is why certain regulations are important to maintain among all interest groups fairly, and we'll see discussions about that in the lobbying process in just the next slide. We also see the free rider. Now, we mentioned this in the past when we talked about social movements, but we also have to remember the free rider is someone who is sympathetic to the objectives of an interest group and enjoys the benefits produced, emphasize that, enjoys the benefits produced without making a notable contribution into them. All interest groups have free riders. It's an inevitable reality, but the extent of the free rider is the extent of the effectiveness of the interest group in achieving their end goal by the means of lobbying, campaign contribution, public education, and grassroots mobilization. So let's look at lobbying, the important means by which interest groups are able to accomplish their end goal of influencing governance. So lobbying is the organized effort to influence policy through direct or indirect means. It is important to understand that without lobbying, pluralism does not exist in a representative democracy. Now, remember, we do not have a direct democracy. We do not have constant engagement, and constant engagement would erode our daily lives for many of us. So what is the best way to address the lack of constant engagement and the lack of desire for constant engagement? It is the existence of lobbying, the ability of interest groups to represent the needs of individuals through their affiliation with groups to those elected officials in the most beneficial way possible. So this is where we really can dive into the theoretical pros and cons, as this has been a pivotal point in our general understanding of governance and a pivotal focus point in how we build our public opinion about government. So what are one of the pros? Well, we see in a pluralist society, like I just said, it is the best and most direct mechanism by which groups can influence their government. Remember, lobbyists can act as policy experts. They represent the needs of their group to elected officials when operating optimally. They can act as experts. You cannot expect a representative to be an expert on the interests of every interest group within their constituency. But you can expect that each interest group has the ability to appoint experts who are not just experts of the needs of their interests in their group, but the way we can convey this to not result in zero-sum policies, to result in policies that allow the liberty of others and the protection of the interests of those within the intended interest group. So they can allow the best skilled individuals to represent the needs in ideal channels to elected officials when operating optimally. And additionally, this is another expansion in which we can access our government, another means by which any average day citizen can affiliate with an interest group and then eventually rise in the ranks and be very influential when it comes to the federal government or your local government. Now, as any issue in politics comes to be, you have to acknowledge there are some cons, or at least some theoretical cons emphasized by the general population. Now, some of these include inequality of access. We acknowledge that interest groups' ability to impact governance depends on their ability to obtain funds. And in an economic system like we have today, where we have such high concentration of wealth in the minority hands of individuals within our economy. We see this results in the most, alongside the Supreme Court cases like Citizens United, the most financially capable individuals influencing politics the most. So this results in an inequality of access if your interest group does not have these sentiments of the wealthy individuals. Think of an interest group aimed at increasing the minimum wage, while an interest group aimed at corporate effectiveness would, if they both had non-professionals representing their interests, you may have a zero-sum policy debate occurring there. In addition, you might have one entity having far more capital than the other and having far more outweighed influence over our government, whether it is, and this is not more capital as in they have the ability to just pay off more representatives. It is not as direct and simple as we often make it sound like when we say things like that. It instead expands their influence to help contribute to certain campaigns, help contribute to super PACs that put out specific campaign messaging, oftentimes revolving around policy sentiments, those issues involved. Remember, one of the three main reasons why we vote the way we vote, well, we see some interest groups mobilize on that dimension of the voter's mindset. We also see there is a opportunity within the practice of lobbying that results in regulatory capture and power distortion. What does this mean? Well, this opens opportunities for industries to influence regulators. It opens the opportunity for an individual who runs a company in, say, electric cars to influence the regulatory laws on electric cars or gas cars for this case. So we do not want those with the most money who have interests within our economic system to influence those regulators of that economic system. So there's one con in the opportunity for regulatory capture and power distortion. And finally, we see that many argue that this dilutes accountability and influences of public opinion. So we see the amount of money in Congress has resulted directly, according to Gallup and Pew Research polling, has directly resulted in many individuals having a lack of trust for our institutions, predominantly the institution of Congress. In addition to this, we see a dilution of the accountability of our elected representatives. It is not just the interests of whatever elected official we are harmed by, but it is the interest group that also helped convey the needs of that collective that resulted in that policy. Now, when we look at the feedback loop of lobbying, we see there is, I'm not the feedback loop, apologies, misspoke there. When we look at the history of lobbying in the US, we see there's a gradual progression through 4 periods. We see the petitioning and personal appeals. Think of this as small-scale collectives signing petitions and directly engaging with government, representing their interests and the interests of those like-minded. This developed after the Reconstruction era. Think of 1877 when we finally pulled troops out of the South, as professional lobbying at the end of the Reconstruction era really expanded. This is a large part due to corporate consolidation as we were expanding and moving into an industrial economy and concentrating the wealth within the United States, which resulted in an expanded influence of corporate entities and their expansion of their professional lobbying within government. We see this eventually developed into a period after World War II in which we had an extreme expansion of interest groups. More interest groups than existed at any point in U.S. history. We had interest groups representing the most nuanced needs of individuals, resulting in, for one, a lot more professional expert representation, but in addition, some more zero-sum policy debates as conflicting interest groups clashed within our federal government. We also see how this developed into what we now see as the contemporary multi-billion-dollar industry of advocacy, which, if you're interested, I can provide a little bit more content on, but for the sake of today's lecture, we'll not be diving into too much detail. When we look at the U.S. Federal Code, the legal code guiding the federal government, we see that it states, quote, lobbying contact means any oral or written communication, including electronic communication with a covered executive branch official or a covered legislative branch official that is made on behalf of a client with regard to the formulation, modification, or adoption of federal legislation, rule, or policy. and you see the legal code there as I included it as a citation. So we see this is the legal guidance for lobbying in Congress and what mobilizes the institution of interest groups to impact the institution of Congress. Now, this is where I just wanted to ramble on for a quick second about my thesis, and for those of you who are examining political polarization in your term paper. So when we talk about political polarization, there are a couple different camps of thought, I guess you could say. There are those who maintain an institutional mindset and institutional analysis thinking. To better understand why people are so divided, you have to look at the governing bodies that they interact with. While there's also those that focus more so on the individual lens and group affiliations of political polarization, those will focus on more so affective and ideological polarization and the role of your group identities, your role of affiliation through elected officials and political parties that result in political polarization. So when we talk about this, I will first present some key ways of looking at polarization, as there are multiple ways of measuring polarization. As you can say, political polarization is the growing ideological distance and partisan hostility between political actors, parties, and the public. Well, what if we're just focusing on the public? Well, that's a more specific dimension of political polarization. What if we're not focusing on their ideological distance, but their general partisan hostility? Then we're looking at affective polarization. What if we're just looking at the policy impacts of their ideological distance? Then we're looking at elite polarization. So let me break this down more simply. Political polarization is the ability or the general sentiment that ideological distance and partisan hostility exist between political actors, parties, and the public. What do we mean by ideological distance? Well, those two words are best described under ideological polarization, which is when individuals separate along a policy or ideological spectrum. Think of this as liberal, conservative, and the polarization between those two entities. And the fact that there are not many people in the middle, and instead there are many people that are close to these extreme ends. Affective polarization focuses on that partisan hostility part of that definition for political polarization, as affective polarization measures the amount in which you dislike or distrust what is referred to as the outgroup, those with other affiliations, either liberal, Republican, conservative, Democratic, whatever it may be, red hair, blonde, whatever the divide is. Affective polarization means that you distrust or dislike the outgroup, and while also favoring your in-group, your own party, your own collective members. Now, when we look at elite polarization, this is where we focus on that in the definition up there, political actors and parties. Those three words right there. This is where elite polarization comes in. This is where you examine political polarization by examining the degree in which our elected officials and general party leaders, major donors, our celebrities, in which those individuals divide among any of these spectrums, but in which they are politically divided along a single spectrum. That is elite polarization. That is measured primarily when we look at elected officials through roll call data, roll call voting measures. How did they vote on legislative bills? How many times did they vote with their party and how many times did they not? That's how you measure elite polarization. And then there is social polarization. This is your partisan divisions that overlap with social divisions like race, religion, geography, education, or other reinforcing means. So think of it as during the civil rights era, we had social polarization, that we saw the divide between partisanship and race, as we saw the George Wallace campaigns and the party realignment around pro-segregationist policies. Now, when we look at political polarization at large, predominantly polarization through the mindset of an institution, we see there's an understanding that there are what's called institutional feedback loops. This is a direction of influence that once again starts with citizens. So we see, just like how we see public opinions formated and influences general politics, we see political polarization of citizens influences governance and eventually influences their lives once again. So we see citizens influence civil society. Think of the media, the institution of the media, institution of interest groups or political parties. Sometimes it goes media, then interest groups, then political parties, or interest groups, media, political parties, oftentimes political parties at the end of that step. But we do see the institutions of these three collectives taking in these sentiments of the general public. Now they will distribute and portray these sentiments to elected officials who will then implement public policy. And that public policy will then impact citizens. Now, when we talk about political polarization, imagine if there was a reinforcing, by that I mean a dimension of the institution that encourages greater division, a reinforcing mechanism within one of these institutions. Let's say interest groups. So let's re-examine the feedback loop with one negative mechanism at play within interest groups that encourages greater political polarization, pointing out how an institutional analysis of polarization identifies institutional dynamics and mechanisms and environmental features that greater influence or greater encourage or discourage rates of political polarization. So let's look at this example with a flaw in interest groups that results in increases in political polarization. So a citizen will be interested in governance. They will say, I got to look more into this. I will obtain my information about this, my deeper understanding via the media, via civil society, and discussing politics with people around me. And you know what? After I did that for a little bit, I've gained a lot of knowledge about about this political issue. So I'm going to go call up my interest groups. And I'm going to advocate for them to represent my interests to my elected officials. Well, I called up the interest group who represents my viewpoint, and they said, we got you. We have people on the ground working to encourage policies that benefit our views. And that interest group, instead of conveying those interests to elected officials, instead they try to provide campaign funds to like-minded officials. This may result in political parties that misrepresent the interests of citizens and civil society because of the outweighed influence of this particular interest group that may be mobilized to have extended influence due to extensive funding from single individuals within their collective. So the political parties now misrepresent the sentiments of civil society. They have more prioritizations of the interests of that particular interest group. They are then winning the elections. They become majorities among the elected bodies. And the public policies they implement, well, they are zero-sum policies representing the interests of that one interest group, and oftentimes dismissing and harming other interest groups. Now, what will this public policy do when it gets back to the citizens? It will impact citizens of different interest groups who will then continue the same loop and result in discussions and focuses on policies that are zero-sum policies. Now, when we look at political polarization, which many of you are for your paper, one thing we all have to do, everybody writing your term paper on this, you will have to do this, or you will get grade deductions on your paper. You have to measure political polarization. You can't talk about something without acknowledging the current state it's in society. So what are the best resources for measuring political polarization? Pew Research. Pew Research Center. Google those words and you will have data points from the biggest 10,000 person public opinion survey that exists in Western democracies, the most expansive public opinion survey, with the most rigorous methodology implemented. So they have great data illustrating what we think, not what you think, not what I think, not what your family thinks, what society statistically, observably, and objectively thinks. Gallup does very similar public opinion polling. They provide a lot of good data, and oftentimes they'll ask questions that Pew Research Center did not directly ask, providing another resource in which you can measure the sentiments of the general population. And roll call voting. Measure how divided our elected representatives really are. What percentage of the time do they vote with their party and vote with counter partisans? This is beneficial in understanding how they operate within the institution of Congress. Are they operating in a way that makes this institution operate effectively and optimally in your eyes? Because you have influence, and you can influence through the means of public opinion and those feedback loops to change the way our institutions operate if you believe they're not operating effectively. And the best way to do that is by first understanding how they're operating objectively through data, empirical data, and not normative sentiments. And roll call voting measures provide an empirical data that helps you understand and interact with this concept. What did we learn? Here's what we learned. Read it, answer it, go to the next slide, make sure you answered these questions correctly, and then make any notes. If you didn't answer it correctly verbally to yourself, write the correct answer 5 times. Correct answers. What's due this week? I gave you guys a little break. You had a quiz 2 weeks ago. You had an assignment last week. This week, relax, review. I am still grading your term papers. It takes over an hour to grade a single paper, so it just takes many days to get all these done. I have multiple other courses I'm teaching as well, so there are many of you with papers that have been sent my way. And remember, I'm commenting on every single sentence. I'm trying to give you guidance on every sentence you write to make the final term paper process a lot easier. So make sure when you get those comments back, you read them and you start writing your final paper. Some of you already have them back. I've just been grading them one by one, sending them back to you right away so you can get started as soon as you please. If you are eager to get started on that term paper, email me. I'll rush your paper. I just acknowledge that some of you will not be working on this until later weeks. My goal is to have all of them graded by the end of this week. So that's a general goal. We no later than halfway through next week, but it should all be done by the end of this week. Give myself a deadline. And you can rush me, by the way, so feel free to rush me. Thank you guys for listening to me ramble on about institutions, a little bit of my thesis here, a little bit of a complex jargon at times, but I bet you're all capable of understanding it because you are all learned individuals and we are learned people through this institution in college. So thank you guys. Email me with any questions. I hope I gave you some foundations that made you interested. And if you are interested, let's dive into more of this content together via email, via Zoom, whatever it is. Let's talk, guys. Thanks, friends. Have a good rest of your week.